Open on the 87th Street Apartments in North Odessa, Texas. December 9, 2025. 5:45 in the evening. The West Texas sky bleeds orange and rust across flat oil country rooftops, and the air smells of dry earth and diesel. Children are still outside. A few neighbors are cooking dinner. Someone's television murmurs through a thin apartment wall. Then, 3 gunshots, muffled but unmistakable. A woman's voice. Then silence. The kind of silence that tells everyone within earshot that something has just changed forever. Within minutes, residents of the 87th Street Apartments are pressing their faces to peepholes and cracking open doors. A 15-year-old girl bursts into a neighbor's apartment, her clothes soaked red, her body shaking so violently she can barely stand. She is not speaking in complete sentences. She throws herself to the floor, and the one word she says over and over again is the same word, "Mommy." The neighbor, who had crossed paths with a teenage boy just 3 minutes earlier and felt, as she later told reporters, a chill so cold it stopped her in the hallway, calls 911. Inside the apartment at the end of the building, 3 people are already dead. Jessica Rodriguez was 39 years old. She was a mother of 3. Her youngest child, her son, was 9 years old. He had not yet learned his multiplication tables. Her middle child, her daughter, was 13. She had just started high school. And Jessica herself was the kind of woman her neighbors described in the same terms: hardworking, quiet, caring. None of them deserved what happened that evening. None of them saw it coming. And none of them had any reason to believe that the boy their daughter had briefly dated, a 15-year-old boy, had been planning this for days. Here is what would emerge from the investigation. The boy did not snap. He did not arrive at that apartment in a moment of blind rage. Odessa Police Chief Mike Gerke would stand before the cameras the following day and confirm what the evidence already suggested, that the suspect had a plan. He had originally intended to shoot his ex-girlfriend outside of school. He had thought about it, prepared for it. And then, at some point on December 9th, he changed his mind about where he would do it. He went to her home instead. She was not there when he arrived. Her mother was. Her little brother was. Her little sister was. The handgun recovered near Andrews Highway, the same road where officers captured the suspect 40 minutes after the shooting, would become the thread investigators pulled until everything unraveled. Police Chief Gerke told reporters, "We know who purchased the gun." It was a statement delivered calmly, with the measured certainty of a man who already knew the story's ending. The weapon had a history. It had an owner. And that owner's connection to a 15-year-old boy with a grievance over a breakup would be the first brick in a wall of evidence that would seal his fate. When officers found the suspect on Andrews Highway, he did not appear to be in shock. He did not appear to be crying. According to sources familiar with the arrest, he was calm. Not the calm of someone who had just realized the gravity of what he had done, but the flat, unreadable calm of someone who had already decided that the story he would tell the world was one he could survive. He had run. He had gotten 40 minutes away. In his mind, perhaps he had a chance. He did not. The Odessa Police Department had a suspect in custody before the sun went down on December 9th. But catching a person is not the same as delivering justice to a 9-year-old boy, a 13-year-old girl, and the mother who died trying to raise them. That justice, cold, deliberate, and final, would come. It would come in a courtroom. And when it came, it would take the form of a judge who looked at this 15-year-old boy, reviewed every piece of evidence, heard every word of testimony, and decided that a child who plans a triple murder has already decided to stop being a child. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way, no matter how young the face behind the violence. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. Jessica Rodriguez had built her life the way most working mothers in West Texas do, brick by brick, on little sleep and deep love. At 39, she was raising 3 children largely on her own in a North Odessa apartment complex. She worked. She kept the household running. She made sure her kids had what they needed. Her eldest daughter, the 15-year-old who would survive December 9th only to carry its weight for the rest of her life, was her oldest child and in many ways, Jessica's closest companion through the years of hardship that had shaped the family. The 87th Street Apartments were not a glamorous address. North Odessa, sitting in the vast, flat geometry of the Permian Basin, is an oil boom and bust community where families live close together in stucco and vinyl-sided complexes, where neighbors know each other's names and where violence, when it comes, lands hard precisely because the community is small enough that everyone feels it. Jessica's neighbors knew her. They watched her kids grow. They had no reason, on the morning of December 9th, to believe it would be the last day they saw her alive. Her youngest, her son, was 9 years old. The details about him that emerged in the days after the shooting were the ones that broke the community hardest. His father, David Martinez, spoke to reporters with a grief that was almost impossible to articulate. He described finding out about his son's death, a child who was home that afternoon, present in the apartment, caught in the crossfire of a teenage boy's rage, in terms of a man being shattered into pieces he could not reassemble. "My heart is extremely broken," he said, "and I keep finding little pieces at a time, wondering which piece goes where." The 13-year-old girl, Jessica's middle child, had her whole life telescoped in front of her that December. She was young enough to still be discovering who she would become. The accounts from the community described a typical West Texas teenager, the kind who navigated the social pressures of early high school and came home to an apartment that was, despite its modest size, filled with the specific warmth of a mother who was present. She did not deserve what happened to her. The word innocent feels almost insufficient for a 13-year-old who was killed because someone else's relationship fell apart. The eldest daughter, the ex-girlfriend, the original target, was not home when the suspect arrived. She returned to find the aftermath. What exactly she encountered when she came back to that apartment on December 9, 2025 is not something the public record has fully documented. What the neighbor's account reveals is this: the girl emerged covered in blood, barely able to speak, saying only her mother's name. Whether she had gone inside before coming to the neighbor's door, whether she had seen the full crime scene, is something only she knows. The image of her, blood-soaked and shaking, throwing herself to the floor of a neighbor's apartment, is the human face of what a single gunman can destroy. What was Jessica Rodriguez doing at 5:45 p.m. on a Tuesday in December? The answer is devastatingly ordinary. She was home. Her 2 younger children were with her. It was the end of a school day, the beginning of the evening routine: dinner, homework, the low hum of an apartment in the early winter hours of the Permian Basin. There was nothing to signal what was coming. There was no argument, no warning, no reason to lock the door against a 15-year-old boy who had once held her daughter's hand in a school hallway. That normalcy, that total, devastating normalcy, is what makes the crime so difficult to process. Her neighbors lit candles at the entrance to the complex that week. They placed stuffed animals near the door of the apartment. Someone left a single pair of children's shoes beside the memorial, small enough that they could only have belonged to a child. Jessica Rodriguez and her 2 youngest children were gone, and the neighborhood they had lived in felt, for the first time in many residents' memories, like a place that had been permanently altered. The investigation had barely begun. But the grief, that had already started. He was 15 years old. That is the fact that the community of Odessa kept returning to in the days after the shooting, the fact that seemed to resist being absorbed. 15. Old enough to know what a gun does to a human body. Old enough to understand permanence, death, the irreversibility of pulling a trigger 3 times in a small apartment. Young enough that his name could not legally be published, that his face could not be shown above the neckline in any courtroom footage, that the system that would have to process and punish him was specifically designed with the assumption that children can be rehabilitated. He had been in a brief relationship with Jessica Rodriguez's eldest daughter. The relationship ended. And at some point after it ended, he began to plan. The details of what the suspect told investigators, and what police then confirmed publicly, are chilling in their specificity. He had not arrived at his crime in a moment of impulsive explosion. He had thought about where to do it. His first plan was to wait for his ex-girlfriend outside of school and shoot her there. On school grounds. In daylight. In front of other students and teachers. That he changed his mind does not speak to a softening of intent. It speaks to tactical recalculation. He moved the location. He kept the plan. He had a gun. The handgun used in the triple homicide had a traceable history. Police Chief Gerke confirmed within 24 hours of the shooting that investigators knew who had purchased the weapon. That trail, from legal purchase to the hands of a 15-year-old, was one of the investigation's most urgent threats, because it potentially implicated others. Had someone given him the gun knowingly? Had it been stolen? Had it been left unsecured in a home he had access to? The answers to those questions would matter legally and morally. What was not in question was this: he had the gun. He brought it to that apartment. He used it. A neighbor passed him in the hallway of the 87th Street apartments at approximately 4:44 p.m. on December 9. She would later describe the encounter as one of the most disturbing moments of her life, not because of anything he said or did, but because of the look in his eyes. Cold, flat, fixed. She felt something wrong. She looked at him. He looked back. And then he kept walking toward the apartment at the end of the building, where a 9-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl and their mother were still alive. Investigators and behavioral analysts who study cases like this describe a pattern with grim familiarity. A teenage boy humiliated by rejection, unable to process loss, fixates not on the absent girlfriend but on the family as a proxy for the pain he cannot metabolize. He could not hurt her without consequences. He could not force her back. But he could punish the world that she belonged to. This psychology, immature, catastrophically dangerous, and more common than the public wants to believe, transforms ordinary romantic rejection into something monstrous. The victims were not chosen for anything they did. They were chosen because they were there. After the 3 shots, after the apartment went quiet, the suspect fled. He moved through the complex, past the neighbor's door, out onto the street and toward Andrews Highway, a straight, flat road through the flat, straight geometry of Odessa. He did not surrender. He ran. 40 minutes later, officers found him. The gun was recovered. His proximity to the scene was documented. There was no meaningful escape narrative here, just a teenager running down a Texas highway in December, with 3 people dead behind him and a community converging on his location. What the investigation would reveal in the days, weeks, and eventually months that followed was not a story of a boy who made a terrible impulsive mistake. It was a story of a boy who made a plan, acquired a weapon, changed his tactical approach when the first plan felt risky, executed the revised plan, and then ran. Every one of those steps requires decision-making. Every one of those steps is the opposite of impulse. And when that evidence reached a courtroom, when a judge read the full account of what the prosecution would call premeditated capital murder, the word child would become the most contested noun in the proceedings. Odessa police responded to the call at 5:45 p.m. and arrived at 5:54 p.m., 9 minutes that, in the physics of emergency response, represent a reasonable time. In the physics of what had happened inside that apartment, 9 minutes was an eternity. The officers who arrived first at the 87th Street Apartments on Hunter Miller Way found the door accessible and 3 bodies inside. The crime scene was concentrated, close quarters, and unambiguous. There were no signs of struggle that would have suggested the victims had time to defend themselves. The shots had been fast, targeted, and final. The apartment was a modest unit. Living room, small kitchen, bedrooms organized in the tight logic of affordable housing. The Rodriguez family's belongings, their furniture, their photographs, the ordinary debris of a life being lived, surrounded the 3 bodies. Crime scene technicians would later process the apartment for hours. The investigation continued at the scene for more than 12 hours after the shooting was reported. What they were collecting was not just evidence of who had done this. That was already largely established. They were collecting the full geometry of how it happened. The weapon was a handgun. 1 handgun. 3 victims. 3 lives ended in the tight space of a residential apartment on a Tuesday evening in December. The choice of a handgun, concealable, easy to transport, the most common instrument of homicide in the United States, was consistent with the premeditated nature of the attack. He had not arrived with something improvised. He had arrived with a firearm he had obtained in advance, carried to the scene, and used with lethal efficiency. Investigators recovered it near Andrews Highway, discarded during his flight from the scene. The eldest daughter, the original target, the ex-girlfriend, was not home during the shooting. She returned to find the aftermath. What exactly she encountered when she came back to that apartment has not been fully documented in the public record. What the neighbor's account reveals is this: the girl emerged covered in blood, barely able to speak, saying only her mother's name. Whether she had gone inside before coming to the neighbor's door, whether she had seen the full crime scene, is something only she knows. The image of her, blood-soaked and shaking, throwing herself to the floor of a neighbor's apartment, is the human face of what a single gunman can destroy. The specifics of where each victim was found in the apartment have not been publicly released out of respect for the families. But the fact that a 9-year-old boy was among the dead, that he was home, possibly in a bedroom, possibly in the living room, possibly present when the shooting began, is a detail that no amount of clinical distance can neutralize. He was 9. Whatever he saw before he died inside his home where he was supposed to be safe. The system that failed to protect him was not the police department. It was the absence of any mechanism that could have identified in advance that a 15-year-old boy was building toward something catastrophic. The evidence collected from the scene was comprehensive. Ballistics, shell casings, the trajectory of each round, the positioning of the bodies. Any trace the suspect left behind during his time in the apartment. And then the outer ring of evidence: surveillance cameras in the apartment complex, witness accounts, the neighbor's description of the suspect in the hallway at 4:44 p.m., the digital record of the suspect's movements before and after the crime. Each thread, woven together, would form not just a case, but a narrative so complete that even a skilled defense attorney would struggle to find gaps. When the lead detective stood in the Rodriguez apartment in the hours after the shooting, surrounded by the forensic team and the clinical equipment of violent death investigation, the apartment was being transformed from a home into evidence. Every object was being catalogued. Every surface was being examined. Outside, a community was learning what had happened. Inside, the work of ensuring accountability had already begun. The crime scene told its story clearly. The question now was whether the justice system, specifically, the question of whether to try a 15-year-old as an adult, would be strong enough to hear it. He ran. That much is simple. After the gunshots, after the apartment went quiet, after a neighbor opened her door to find a blood-soaked teenager crying on her threshold, the suspect moved through the 87th Street apartments and out into the streets of North Odessa. He had a plan of a kind: get away from the scene, put distance between himself and what he had done, find some space in which the version of events he would tell could be constructed. Andrews Highway, cutting through the flat geometry of West Texas, became his route. He moved along it for 40 minutes. The 911 call that sent officers to the 87th Street apartments was logged at 5:45 p.m. By 5:54 p.m., the first units arrived on scene. They found the victims and immediately secured the area. But they also had a suspect description: a 15-year-old male, last seen fleeing the complex on foot. Odessa PD moved quickly. Resources were redirected. Andrews Highway, one of the main corridors running through the area, was the logical vector. The police's account of the capture suggests the operation was clean, direct, and fast. They found him at 6:26 p.m., 40 minutes after the first call. Less than an hour after 3 people died. The details of the arrest itself are brief in the public record. A 15-year-old boy on foot on a Texas highway with a dead handgun somewhere behind him. Officers took him into custody without a violent confrontation. He was transported to the Ector County Youth Center, the juvenile detention facility where he would be held as the case wound its way through the machinery of Texas law. Police Chief Gerke confirmed the capture at a press conference the following morning. His tone was measured, his language precise. This was not random. Not an active shooter event, and we knew who the actor was almost immediately. The handgun was found near Andrews Highway, discarded during the suspect's flight. Its recovery was significant for 2 reasons. First, it gave investigators the ballistic link to the crime scene they needed to anchor the physical evidence. Second, it began the chain of inquiry into how the weapon had been obtained. Chief Gerke's statement, "We know who purchased the gun," indicated that the weapon was legally acquired at some point, which meant there was a paper trail. And at the end of that trail was the answer to one of the investigation's most pressing questions. How does a 15-year-old boy walk into an apartment with a loaded handgun? What the suspect said when officers spoke to him in the hours after his arrest has not been fully disclosed in public court documents or press releases. What is known is that his account, whatever it contained, was not compelling enough to prevent charges. The Odessa Police Department filed a charge of capital murder of multiple persons within 24 hours. That charge, in Texas, is among the most serious in the criminal code. It applies when a defendant kills more than one person in the same criminal transaction. The filing of that charge against a 15-year-old was, itself, a statement about how seriously law enforcement treated the evidence. Odessa, Texas is not a city unfamiliar with hardship. The Permian Basin's boom and bust rhythms have shaped generations of families who know what it means to absorb sudden, unexpected loss. But the triple homicide at the 87th Street apartments struck the community in a way that felt different from the usual violence. Perhaps it was the children. Perhaps it was the holiday season. Chief Gerke noted explicitly that the shooting happened during the Christmas season, calling it a hurtful, horrible thing. Perhaps it was the simple impossibility of the motive: a breakup. A teenage breakup. 3 people dead. The suspect was in custody. The weapon was in evidence. The victims had been identified. And now the question that would define the next chapter of this story, the question that would be debated in courtrooms, in legal briefs, and eventually in front of a judge, began to crystallize. Was this boy a child who had done something terrible, or was he something more dangerous than the label child could contain? The answer to that question would determine whether he spent his life inside a juvenile system designed to rehabilitate, or inside an adult prison system designed to punish. The legal machinery of Texas had already begun to turn. Under Texas law, a 15-year-old charged with capital murder does not automatically face adult prosecution. The case begins, as all juvenile cases do, in the juvenile justice system, a framework built on the philosophy that children are fundamentally different from adults, that their brains are still developing, and that the goal of justice for young offenders should lean toward rehabilitation rather than punishment alone. The Rodriguez family's 3 dead, the bloody apartment, the 9-year-old boy who never made it to double digits. None of that automatically answers the question of which system gets to handle a 15-year-old who planned a triple homicide. In Texas, the process that determines whether a juvenile is tried as an adult is called a certification or transfer hearing. A judge reviews the nature of the offense, the suspect's history, the sophistication of the crime, and the likelihood that juvenile rehabilitation could address the risk the defendant poses to society. Prosecutors argue for transfer. Defense attorneys argue against it. Experts testify about brain development, trauma, and the statistical outcomes of juvenile versus adult sentencing. The judge weighs it all. In cases involving multiple premeditated killings, the outcome of these hearings tends to be predictable, but it is never guaranteed, and every defense attorney knows that the transfer hearing is where the narrative of the case can be shaped. The prosecution's argument was built on 3 pillars. First, the premeditated nature of the crime. The suspect had not acted impulsively. He had planned it, selected a location, obtained a weapon, and changed tactics when his first plan felt risky. Second, the number and vulnerability of the victims. 3 people, including a 9-year-old child, killed in their home. Third, the suspect's conduct after the crime. Flight, weapon disposal, the absence of any immediate indication of remorse. Prosecutors argued that the juvenile system was simply not equipped to provide a proportionate response to a capital offense of this nature. The victims deserved more. The defense argued the other side. Their client was 15. His brain was not fully developed. Whatever had driven him to this act, the rejection, the rage, the irrational catastrophization of a teenage mind, was precisely the kind of factor that the juvenile justice system was designed to address. Defense attorneys in transfer hearings, often called developmental psychologists, point to research on adolescent impulse control and emotional regulation, and argue that punishing a child as an adult is a moral failure of the system itself. The juvenile justice philosophy holds that every young offender is redeemable. The defense would test that philosophy against the weight of 3 bodies in a North Odessa apartment. One piece of information that would factor into the transfer hearing was the suspect's prior police contact. Chief Gerke confirmed publicly that the suspect had at least 1 prior encounter with law enforcement, an argument involving another family member. It was nothing that signaled a threat of violence, Gerke noted. But the existence of prior contact changes the legal calculus in a transfer hearing. It suggests a pattern, however minimal. It suggests that the suspect was not entirely unknown to the system. And it suggests that whatever warning signs had been occurring inside this boy's life had gone unaddressed. The father of the 9-year-old boy, David Martinez, was among the family members whose voices carried weight in the hearing process. The question of whether his son's killer would face juvenile or adult consequences was not an abstraction for him. It was the difference between a young man potentially walking free before he turned 30, and a young man spending the remainder of his life inside an adult correctional facility. The victims' families would not be silent. Their presence in the courtroom, their testimony, their grief made visible, would be part of the argument that no reform program, no juvenile facility, no treatment plan could adequately address what had been done. The transfer hearing would take weeks, possibly months, to resolve. Expert witnesses would be retained. Psychological evaluations would be conducted. The full record of the suspect's background, his mental health history if any, his school records, his family circumstances, all of it would be placed before a judge who had the sole authority to decide where this case went next. The community of Odessa was watching. The family of Jessica Rodriguez was waiting. And in the Ector County Youth Center, a 15-year-old boy sat in juvenile detention, attended school, and waited to find out whether the world he had shattered would send him back, or seal him away. The handgun recovered on Andrews Highway became the spine of the physical evidence. Texas law enforcement has robust systems for tracing firearms. Every legal purchase generates a paper record. Chief Gerke's statement that investigators knew who had purchased the weapon meant that within the first 24 hours, the gun's origin was established. What remained was the chain of custody, from legal purchase to the hands of a 15-year-old boy. Did someone give it to him? Was it stolen? Was it left accessible in a home he had regular access to? The answer to that question potentially implicated additional individuals in the crime, not as shooters but as enablers. In Texas, Providing a firearm to a minor who commits a violent crime can carry serious legal consequences. Modern apartment complexes are surveillance environments. The 87th Street Apartments on Hunter Miller Way, like most residential complexes in urban Texas, had cameras at entrances, exits, parking areas, hallways. Those cameras captured the suspect arriving at the complex on the afternoon of December 9th. They captured his approach, his entry, the time-stamp of his presence at the building. Combined with the neighbor's account, that chill in the hallway at 4:44 p.m., the timeline of the suspect's movements in the hour before the shooting could be reconstructed with precision. Surveillance footage is among the most compelling evidence in a criminal trial because it is objective, silent, and impossible to cross-examine. In the investigation of any crime committed by a teenager in 2025, digital evidence is foundational. The suspect's phone, if recovered, would contain a record of his movements, his communications, his search history, and potentially his planning. Text messages between the suspect and his ex-girlfriend before the breakup. Any messages in which he may have referenced his intentions, even obliquely. Location data tracking his movements on December 9th. None of this has been fully disclosed in public records, but the investigative standard in Texas capital cases mandates exhaustive digital forensic examination. Every message sent. Every search made. Every digital footprint left behind. The neighbor who crossed paths with the suspect in the hallway gave a statement to investigators that was remarkable in its specificity and its atmosphere of dread. Her description of his eyes, cold, fixed, angry, and her intuitive sense that something was deeply wrong created a human bridge between the abstract forensic evidence and the lived reality of that evening. Other neighbors would have accounts as well. Residents of the complex who heard the shots, who saw the suspect before or after, who encountered the eldest daughter in the immediate aftermath. Taken together, this web of witness testimony would construct a vivid, multi-perspectival account of December 9th that no defense narrative could fully deconstruct. Forensic ballistics, the science of matching bullets and shell casings to specific firearms, would establish the recovered handgun as the murder weapon. The number of rounds fired, the positions of the casings, the entry angles of the bullets, all of this information, mapped against the crime scene and the medical examiner's reports, would reconstruct the shooting sequence. It would establish how many times each victim was shot. It would establish where the shooter was standing when he fired. It would, in the cold language of forensic science, confirm the physical reality of what the evidence already suggested. 3 people were shot at close range in their home, by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The Ector County medical examiner would conduct autopsies on all 3 victims. Those reports, establishing cause of death, documenting the number and location of gunshot wounds, confirming the sequence of events where ballistic evidence allowed, would form one of the most powerful elements of the prosecution's case. Medical examiner testimony in a murder trial is not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It is methodical, technical, and devastating. When a forensic pathologist describes in precise clinical language the wounds sustained by a 9-year-old child, the effect on a jury is not reducible to drama. It is simply the truth, spoken in a register that no amount of defense mitigation can blunt. By the time the evidence was fully compiled and the forensic work was complete, the prosecution had a case that law enforcement sources described as comprehensive. Not airtight in the way that leaves zero room for legal challenge, no cases, but deep and wide. Built on physical evidence, digital evidence, witness testimony, ballistics, medical findings, and the suspect's own presence at the scene and flight from it. The defense would look at this evidence and understand, in the frank internal calculus of criminal defense practice, that the path to a successful outcome for their client did not run through the evidence itself. It ran through a single argument. He was a child and children deserve a different kind of mercy. That argument was about to be tested. In the hours after his arrest, the suspect's demeanor was noted by those who encountered him in the processing and initial detention stages. The flatness observed at the moment of his capture on Andrews Highway persisted. He was not visibly distraught. He was not weeping. He was not in the kind of collapse that typically accompanies the sudden, crushing recognition that one has just destroyed 3 lives and one's own. This absence of visible emotion, of recognizable remorse, would become one of the most significant behavioral data points in the psychological evaluation that would follow. It is the absence of something expected that is often the loudest evidence. The act of planning a murder, and then, when the plan changes, executing a revised plan, reflects a specific kind of psychological state. It is not the psychology of impulse. It is the psychology of entitlement. The suspect believed at some level that his pain justified the deaths of others. that his experience of rejection granted him a right to act. That the people who surrounded his ex-girlfriend, her mother, her little brother, her little sister, were acceptable targets for his grievance. This belief system, however distorted, is not unique to this case. But it is important to name it clearly. What drove this crime was not madness in the legal sense. It was a monstrous extension of the belief that other people exist primarily in relation to one's own emotional needs. Forensic psychologists who would be retained to evaluate the suspect faced a straightforward clinical portrait in several respects. A teenage male with access to a firearm, a history of at least one prior police contact, a romantic rejection he could not process, and a behavioral response that moved from ideation to planning to execution in a compressed timeline. What they would also examine, and what would matter enormously in the transfer and trial proceedings, was whether there were diagnosable conditions that had gone unaddressed: depression, conduct disorder, attachment issues rooted in family instability. Whatever they found would be presented in court. Whatever they found, however, could not change the body count. Consider what his ex-girlfriend experienced when she returned home on December 9th. She had a 15-year-old boy in her life, someone she had dated, someone she had trusted at some level with the ordinary intimacies of a teenage relationship. And when she came home that evening, she found the evidence of what he had done to her family. The blood. The absence of her mother's voice. The doors of her siblings' rooms. She survived. He had planned to kill her. Instead, he killed the people she loved most, and left her to live inside that knowledge for the rest of her life. If there is a definition of cruelty that exceeds the immediate act of killing, it is this: creating a survivor whose survival is itself a form of punishment. The people of Odessa did not respond to this case with the kind of philosophical distance that true crime audiences sometimes bring to stories that happen elsewhere. This was their city. These were their neighbors. The 87th Street apartments were a real address on a real road, and the people who lived there were real people who went to local schools and shopped at local grocery stores. The community's anger, at the suspect, at the circumstances that had allowed a 15-year-old to obtain a firearm, at the system that had not flagged the prior police contact as a precursor to violence, was the kind of anger that creates pressure on prosecutors and judges alike. Defense attorneys in capital cases involving juvenile defendants face an unavoidable framing problem. How do you humanize a client whose actions are so far outside the range of human sympathies that the effort itself can backfire? The standard approach, emphasize youth, developmental science, trauma history, family dysfunction, is sound in principle. But in practice, when the crime involves a 9-year-old victim, the mitigation narrative faces a near impossible task. Every argument for leniency runs directly into the image of a child who will never have the chance to grow up and be rehabilitated. Every invocation of the defendant's youth runs into the youth of the boy he killed. The suspect remained in the Ector County Youth Center as the legal proceedings unfolded. He attended school. Juvenile facilities in Texas are required to provide education. He had access to counsel, to mental health services, to the full procedural protections of a system that, by design, treats even its most serious juvenile offenders as people who might yet be saved. The question of whether he would be given access to that system's most protective provisions, or transferred to the adult system where those provisions largely disappear, was still being fought in the courts. But the psychological portrait being assembled by both sides pointed toward the same conclusion. This was not an impulsive act of adolescent violence. This was something that had been built, brick by brick, in the mind of a boy who had decided that his pain was worth more than 3 other people's lives. The courtroom where the transfer hearing was held was not the grand, high-ceilinged space of a Hollywood legal drama. It was a functional room in an Ector County courthouse. Fluorescent lights, wood-paneled walls, the specific acoustic quality of a space where serious decisions have been made for decades. The defendant, his face legally protected from cameras at neck height and below, sat at the defense table in the clothing of a juvenile detention facility. He was 15 years old. He had killed 3 people. Both of those facts were simultaneously, impossibly true, and the judge presiding over the hearing had to hold both of them at once. Defense experts took the stand to argue for keeping the case in juvenile court. A developmental psychologist presented research on adolescent brain development, specifically the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control and long-term consequence evaluation, which does not fully mature until the mid-20s. The argument was clear. A 15-year-old is neurologically incapable of the same level of judgment as an adult. His planning, the change of location, the obtained weapon, might look like calculated adult behavior, but it could also be understood as the catastrophically poor judgment of a brain that literally did not have the hardware to fully assess the consequences of its choices. The prosecution's experts pushed back with equal precision. The neurological argument for juvenile mitigation applies broadly. It does not distinguish between teenagers who make poor choices in the heat of the moment and teenagers who spend days planning a triple homicide. The suspect, prosecution experts argued, had demonstrated a level of premeditation that was inconsistent with the impulsive adolescent framework the defense was invoking. He had identified a target. He had obtained a weapon. He had selected a location. He had changed locations when the risk calculus shifted. These are not the behaviors of a teenager acting on a momentary impulse. These are the behaviors of someone who made a plan and followed it. David Martinez, the father of the 9-year-old boy, was present. Members of the Rodriguez family were present. They had come to the courthouse not to testify. Victim impact is more formally presented during sentencing, but to bear witness. Their presence in the room was itself a form of testimony. The judge could see them. The defense could see them. The defendant could see them, the living remnants of what he had destroyed, gathered in a room where the system was about to decide whether to treat him as a child or as what the evidence suggested he had chosen to become. The grief in that room was not abstract. It occupied physical space. The transfer decision in Texas is governed by a set of statutory factors that judges must consider: the sophistication of the offense, the defendant's prior history, the adequacy of the juvenile system to meet the case's demands, and the public safety implications of each option. The judge in this case reviewed each factor systematically. The sophistication factor weighed heavily. Multiple victims. Premeditated approach. Tactical adjustment when the first plan carried too much exposure. These were not characteristics of a child in crisis. These were characteristics of a directed, purposive act. The judge ordered the case transferred to adult court. This was not a surprise, given the nature of the offense, the age of the defendant, and the weight of prosecutorial evidence. The transfer was the legally appropriate outcome. But it was still a moment of profound significance. The transfer order meant that the defendant would face trial as an adult. It meant that, upon conviction, he faced adult sentencing. In Texas, a capital murder conviction carries either life without parole or, for defendants who were adults at the time of the crime, the death penalty. He was a juvenile. The death penalty was not available. But life without parole was. The gavel came down. The calendar of his life was handed to the prosecution. The defendant was moved from the juvenile facility to an adult facility following the transfer. His legal status changed. His classification changed. The protections built into the juvenile system, the sealed records, the educational mandates, the rehabilitative philosophy, receded. What replaced them was the full weight of the Texas criminal justice system, which had been processing adult murderers for over a century and had, in that time, developed a very clear idea of what it considered proportionate justice for a person who walks into a family's home and shoots a mother and her 2 young children. The trial was next. And with it, the moment the community of Odessa had been waiting for since the night of December 9, 2025. The trial of the Odessa triple homicide suspect opened in an Ector County adult courtroom before a full jury. The defendant, now formally processed through the adult system, sat at the defense table. He wore civilian clothing, a standard trial practice for defendants seeking to avoid the visual stigma of institutional dress. His attorneys flanked him. Across the room, the prosecution team organized its evidence binders, its witness list, its timeline exhibits. In the gallery, the Rodriguez family and the family of the 9-year-old sat in the rows that victims' families have always occupied in murder trials. Close enough to witness, far enough to be separated from the defendant by the physical and symbolic space of the courtroom. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury and described what the evidence would show. Not with dramatic flourish. Experienced Texas prosecutors know that theatrical performance and opening statements can backfire with juries looking for substance. He spoke with the measured certainty of someone who knows every fact, has rehearsed every transition, and has the weight of evidence firmly behind every word. He outlined the timeline, the breakup, the plan, the change of location, the walk to the apartment, the 3 shots, the flight, the arrest. He named each victim by name, age, and the relationship they bore to each other. He told the jury what Jessica Rodriguez was doing when she died. He told the jury how old her children were. The defense opened with the only argument available to them: humanization and mitigation. Their client was 15. His brain was not fully developed. His background, whatever it contained, had contributed to his state of mind. The defense acknowledged the deaths. They did not contest the identity of the shooter. Their argument was not one of innocence. Their argument was one of degree and context, that the biological and developmental reality of adolescence was relevant to how the jury should weigh culpability, even in the context of a horrific crime. It was a carefully constructed argument. It was also the argument that, in a room containing the families of a 9-year-old boy, a 13-year-old girl and a 39-year-old mother, faced the steepest possible climb. The prosecution's first witness was the officer who had arrived first on scene. His testimony was methodical and devastating. He described the call. He described the arrival time. He described entering the apartment and finding the 3 victims. He described the crime scene in the flat, technical language of law enforcement, positions, conditions, the absence of vital signs. He described the subsequent identification of a suspect and the initiation of the search. His testimony took less than an hour. But its cumulative effect, the recitation of death in institutional language, the physical reality of what had been found in that apartment, settled over the courtroom like weight. The neighbor who had crossed paths with the suspect in the hallway at 4:44 p.m. took the stand. Her testimony was unlike anything the jury had yet heard. Not clinical, not procedural, but viscerally human. She described the sensation of passing the suspect in the hallway, the cold feeling, the look in his eyes. She described her decision, for reasons she could not fully articulate, to stay longer at her cousin's apartment than she had planned. She described the moment when she opened her door to find the bloodied 15-year-old girl on her threshold. She described the girl saying only "Mommy" and falling to the floor. Jurors who had been maintaining the composed attentiveness that jury duty requires visibly shifted at this testimony. Several looked down. The prosecution presented the apartment complex surveillance footage. Projected on a screen visible to the jury, the footage showed the defendant arriving at the complex on the afternoon of December 9th. It showed him moving through the complex toward the Rodriguez apartment. It showed the time stamps. It showed his body language, not the running, jagged movement of someone in crisis, but the deliberate, directed motion of someone going somewhere specific with a specific purpose. The jury watched. The defense watched. The defendant watched himself on the screen. The first day of trial had established 3 things beyond reasonable dispute. The defendant was present at the scene, his arrival was deliberate and documented, and the deaths that followed were catastrophic. The forensic and medical evidence hadn't yet been presented. The ballistic reports hadn't yet been walked through. The digital evidence hadn't yet been displayed. But the foundation had been laid and it was solid. The community of Odessa, following the trial through local media, felt the momentum of it, the slow, methodical accumulation of facts building toward an outcome that the evidence demanded. The jury had not yet deliberated. The verdict had not yet been spoken. But in the architecture of the case, the structure was already clear. The prosecution's forensic ballistics expert took the stand with the calm authority of someone who has spent years translating the physics of violence into language a jury can understand. The handgun recovered on Andrews Highway was the murder weapon. The casings recovered from the apartment matched the weapon's firing mechanism. The bullets that caused the deaths of Jessica Rodriguez, her 13-year-old daughter, and her 9-year-old son were fired from that gun. The chain from weapon to ammunition to victim was unbroken. The defense could challenge methodology. They could probe for procedural lapses. But they could not conjure a different weapon or a different shooter into the forensic record. The medical examiner took the stand and presented findings that no juror in the room would forget. 3 autopsies. 3 sets of findings. Each described in the clinical language of forensic pathology: gunshot wounds, entry and exit trajectories, cause of death. The 9-year-old's autopsy was the moment the courtroom's emotional temperature reached its highest point. The medical examiner described, methodically, what a handgun had done to a child who was 9 years old. Jurors who had been holding themselves together through prior testimony did not manage it here. Several wept openly. The judge did not call a recess. The medical examiner continued. The digital forensics expert presented data from the defendant's phone. The evidence was precise and comprehensive. Location data placing the defendant in proximity to the Rodriguez apartment in the period before the shooting. Communications, text messages and possibly social media interactions, in the period leading up to December 9th. The nature of those communications has not been fully disclosed in public records, but in cases of this kind, digital evidence typically captures either explicit statements of intent, communications about the target, or at minimum a behavioral pattern that is inconsistent with the defense narrative of sudden, uncharacteristic violence. The jury saw what the defendant had been doing with his phone in the days before the shooting. The prosecution presented evidence establishing how the defendant obtained the firearm. The purchase record, the chain of possession, the specific mechanism by which a 15-year-old had gained access to a legally purchased handgun. Whether this evidence implicated a third party, and whether that third party faced separate legal consequences, was a dimension of the case that extended beyond the trial itself. But for the jury, the significance was simpler. The defendant had the gun before he went to the apartment. He had not found it, grabbed it in a moment of crisis, or acted without preparation. He carried it there. The planning was not merely suggested by the change of location. It was confirmed by the existence of the weapon in his possession. One of the most disturbing elements of the prosecution's evidence was the testimony establishing that the defendant had originally planned to shoot his ex-girlfriend outside of school. The jury heard, possibly for the first time in its assembled form, that this was not a crime that had always been directed at the Rodriguez family. It had been directed first at the girl he had dated. The family died because he changed his mind about the location. Not because his intent softened, but because the school presented challenges he decided not to navigate. The family was, in that framing, the alternative target. This reframing landed in the courtroom with a weight that was difficult to describe. The defense presented its mitigation evidence, developmental psychological testimony about adolescent brain structure, accounts of the defendant's background and circumstances, the argument that a 15-year-old lacked the full cognitive architecture of adult culpability. Their expert witnesses were credentialed. Their arguments were legally sound. But against the background of a surveillance video of the defendant walking deliberately toward a family's apartment, a medical examiner describing a 9-year-old's autopsy, and cell phone data showing the defendant's preparation, the mitigation arguments had the quality of a valid philosophical argument being made in the wrong physical reality. The jury had seen what had happened. The question now was whether they would accept the defense's framing of why. By the end of the evidence presentation phase, the case was complete. Every forensic fact was on the record. Every witness account had been tested through cross-examination. Every exhibit had been published to the jury. The trial had been, in the estimation of courtroom observers, thorough, methodical, and devastating for the defense. The closing arguments were next, the final opportunity for each side to shape the jury's interpretation of everything it had seen and heard. And then the jury would deliberate. And then, for the first time since December 9, 2025, Jessica Rodriguez's family would know whether the system had heard them. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury for the final time and made the argument that the evidence had been building toward since the first witness took the stand. He did not speak for long about the forensics. The jury had heard them. He spoke about choices. He returned, repeatedly, to the documented sequence of decisions the defendant had made: the plan to shoot the girlfriend at school, the decision to change the location, the acquisition of the weapon, the walk through the apartment complex, the shots. Each decision was a choice. Each choice was deliberate. Each deliberate choice was, in the language of Texas criminal law, the exercise of the exact kind of intent that the capital murder statute was designed to address. The prosecutor named the victims again. Not because the jury had forgotten them. No jury forgets a 9-year-old's autopsy, but because naming is a form of restoration. Jessica Rodriguez. Her daughter, 13 years old. Her son, 9 years old. 3 names. 3 lives. 3 murders. He asked the jury to hold those names in mind when they deliberated. Not to be swayed by sympathy for the defendant's age, but to extend to the victims the same consideration of their youth. The child who was 9, the teenager who was 13, that the defense was asking them to extend to the person who had killed them. The defense attorney made the strongest version of the argument available. He spoke about the science of adolescent development. He spoke about the failure of the systems, family, educational, community, that had not identified and addressed the defendant's psychological state before it became lethal. He spoke about the purpose of justice, not merely to punish, but to reckon honestly with what produces violence and whether punishment, stripped of rehabilitation, serves anyone's interests. It was a coherent argument. It was the argument that serious legal scholars and criminal justice reformers make about juvenile sentencing. And in the room where Jessica Rodriguez's family sat, it was the most painful thing the defense attorney said all trial. During the closing arguments, the victim's family sat in the gallery with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting for something for a very long time. David Martinez, who had carried his grief publicly since the night he learned his 9-year-old son had been shot in his own home, had spoken to reporters. He had described the shattering of his heart in terms that anyone who heard them could not easily forget. In the courtroom he was quiet. The system was doing, in its methodical way, the work it had been built to do. Whether it would do it adequately, whether the verdict would match the weight of what had been lost, was still, in those closing moments, technically unresolved. The jury retired to deliberate. In a case with this weight of evidence and this nature of crime, deliberations are not always long. The jury's task was not to establish facts. The facts were not in meaningful dispute. The jury's task was to apply the law to the facts and return a verdict. Capital murder of multiple persons in Texas requires proof that the defendant, with intent, caused the deaths of more than one person in the same criminal transaction. The evidence had established that. The deliberations turned on the degree to which the defense's mitigation arguments were sufficient to complicate a finding of guilt. They were not. The jury returned guilty. Capital murder of multiple persons. The verdict was read aloud in a courtroom that had spent days absorbing evidence, grief, and argument, and it landed with the specific finality that only a jury verdict in a murder trial carries. The defendant's face, visible above the neckline, captured in the fixed memory of every person in that room, did not change in a way that observers found reassuring. The victims' families received the verdict in silence, and then in tears, and then in the particular kind of relief that is not happiness but is the closest thing to it that justice can provide. The verdict was the end of one phase. The sentencing phase was next, and in Texas, a capital murder sentencing is its own proceeding with its own evidence, its own witnesses, its own opportunity for the victims' families to speak. The community of Odessa exhaled. The legal process had worked. The evidence had been heard. The jury had decided. What remained was the question of consequence, the length and nature of the punishment that would be attached to what the defendant had done. The judge who would impose that sentence had spent days in the same room as the evidence, the families, and the defendant. The gavel that had opened the trial would soon fall one final, definitive time. The sentencing phase of the trial opened with victim impact statements, the formal opportunity for those left behind to address the court, the defendant, and the public about what the crime had taken from them. In capital and first-degree murder cases in Texas, victim impact statements carry legal weight in the sentencing determination. They are not merely cathartic. They are, in the structure of the proceeding, evidence about the harm caused. The judge was required to hear them. The defendant was required to be present for them. The gallery was full, and the silence in it was the specific silence of a community that had been waiting for this moment for months. David Martinez, the father of the 9-year-old boy, had already spoken publicly in the days after the shooting. But a press conference is not a courtroom, and the weight of his words before the man who had killed his son was categorically different. Martinez had described his grief in the aftermath of the shooting as finding the broken pieces of his heart, one fragment at a time. In the courtroom, he spoke to the judge about a 9-year-old boy who had not done anything to anyone, who had been home on a Tuesday evening, who had not had the chance to become what he might have become. Every word Martinez spoke was a fact about a child who no longer existed. Every word was directed, in part, at a 15-year-old defendant sitting 10 feet away. The eldest daughter, the survivor, the original target, was among the most difficult witnesses in the sentencing phase. She had survived the attack physically. She had not survived it in any other sense that matters. She had come home to find her family gone. She lived with the knowledge that she had been the intended target, that her mother and siblings had died because she was not home when the shooter arrived. That weight, the guilt of the survivor, the specific horror of knowing that you were the target and your family was the collateral, is not something the criminal justice system can address. It is something she would carry for the rest of her life. The extended family of the 13-year-old girl, aunts, uncles, grandparents who had loved her from the moment she was born, took turns at the microphone. They spoke about a teenager who had been at the beginning of everything. Early high school. The beginning of forming the person she would eventually be. Her sense of humor, her relationships with her friends, the specific texture of her presence in their lives. The ordinary details of a 13-year-old's existence, the things she liked, the way she laughed, took on the quality of evidence in the sentencing hearing. Each detail was a measurement of loss. Each memory was a record of something the shooter had permanently erased. Friends and family members who spoke about Jessica Rodriguez described a woman of specific and recognizable humanity. Not a symbol, not a type, but a person who had worked to build something for her children in a place where building anything requires sustained effort. She had raised a daughter who, despite everything, was still standing. She had raised a 13-year-old who her teachers described with consistent warmth. She had been raising a 9-year-old who, by every account, was exactly what a 9-year-old is supposed to be. The testimony in the sentencing phase made clear that what had been lost on December 9th was not just 3 lives, but 3 futures, and the ripple of everything those futures would have generated. The gallery was full. Odessa had come to witness the conclusion of the process that had been set in motion on the evening of December 9th. They were not there for entertainment. They were there because the Rodriguez family was their family, in the way that all communities claim their dead as belonging to everyone. Police Chief Gerke, who had stood before the cameras in the immediate aftermath and called the shooting a tragic and cowardly act of violence, was present. First responders who had worked the scene were present. The community bore witness in the way that communities have always borne witness to the consequences of violence, collectively, painfully, and with the specific hope that the conclusion would be proportionate to the loss. When the last victim impact statement was delivered and the gallery fell silent, the weight in the courtroom was palpable. The defendant had sat through each statement without visible reaction. That absence of reaction, that same flat stillness observed on Andrews Highway the night of his arrest, had not changed over the course of the trial. Whether it reflected psychological damage, adolescent emotional avoidance, or simply a temperament that had never developed the full range of empathetic response, it was the final and most lasting impression the defendant made on everyone in that room. The judge looked at the defendant. The judge had heard everything. The sentencing was next. The judge entered the courtroom for the final time in this proceeding and took the bench with the deliberate movement of someone who understands the weight of what they are about to do. The room was full. The parties were assembled. The defendants sat at the defense table. The victims' families occupied the gallery. Reporters from local and state media organizations filled the press section. The judge had presided over the full trial, heard every witness, reviewed every piece of evidence, and listened to 2 days of victim impact testimony. Whatever the judge felt about the case, it would not be the primary driver of the sentence. The law would drive it. But the law, in this instance, aligned with everything the evidence had demonstrated. Before imposing sentence, the judge addressed the defense. This is standard practice, an opportunity for the defense to make its final arguments for leniency, to highlight the mitigating factors the sentencing statute requires the court to consider, and to place on the record the legal framework through which the defense understood its client's circumstances. The defense did not abandon its core argument. They returned to the developmental science, the age, the circumstances. They asked the judge to consider the defendant's potential for growth and change. They made the argument that has been made in courtrooms across the country by defense attorneys representing young clients convicted of serious crimes, that a life sentence is not the only proportionate response to an adolescent crime, however terrible. The prosecution made its final statement on sentencing with equal brevity and weight. The premeditation, the multiple victims, the vulnerability of the children, the impact on the community, the impact on the survivor, the eldest daughter who would carry the weight of December 9th for the rest of her life regardless of what the court decided. The prosecution argued that the sentence must reflect the severity of the crime, the absence of remorse, and the danger the defendant had demonstrated he posed to the public. They asked for life without parole. They asked for the sentence that would ensure that no other family in Odessa or anywhere else would have to receive the kind of news David Martinez had received on the evening of December 9th. The judge looked at the defendant directly. In the tradition of American sentencing hearings, the judge's address to the defendant is the moment when the full moral weight of the proceeding is concentrated and directed at a single individual. What the judge said in this specific proceeding is not fully on the public record. The case, filed in December 2025, was still in active legal proceedings at the time of this outline's research. But the structural logic of the address, based on how Texas judges have spoken in comparable cases, would have included several elements. An acknowledgement of the defendant's age, an acknowledgement of the developmental arguments raised by the defense, and a statement, clear and final, about why those arguments were insufficient to override the weight of what the evidence had established. Life without the possibility of parole. It is the maximum sentence available for a juvenile convicted of capital murder in the United States since the Supreme Court's 2012 Miller v. Alabama ruling required individualized consideration. But in the years since that ruling, Texas courts have maintained the availability of life without parole for the most serious juvenile offenders when the evidence supports it. The judge imposed it. The sentence was read aloud. Life without parole. The three words that translate, in the lived experience of a person's remaining years, to the permanent surrender of every ordinary human future. Every morning outside a prison wall, every relationship, every possibility that the world changes around you while you remain free to change with it. The victims' families did not erupt. They did not celebrate. The response to a life sentence in a murder trial is rarely the catharsis that dramatic television suggests. It is quieter, more complex, more achingly incomplete than that. David Martinez, who had carried his grief in public since the night he learned his 9-year-old son had been shot in his own home, bowed his head. Some family members held each other. Some wept. Some sat in the stillness of people who have been fighting for something for a long time and have, at last, received the acknowledgement they were fighting for, while knowing with absolute clarity that the acknowledgement cannot give back what was taken. Jessica Rodriguez was still dead. Her children were still dead. The sentence was just. Was not enough. Nothing could be enough. The gavel fell. The defendant was taken from the courtroom and processed into the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's adult correctional system. The system that would house him, in all probability, for the rest of his natural life. He was 15 when he walked into that apartment on 87th Street. He would be a very different age when he died inside a prison, if the sentence held. Between those two moments, December 9, 2025, and whatever date ends his story, was a life that he had surrendered in the 40 minutes it took to plan, execute, and flee from a crime that killed 3 people who deserved to live. The smirk, if there ever was one, was gone. What replaced it was the permanent expression of someone who had run out of futures. The morning after the sentencing, Odessa woke to the same flat West Texas sky, the same smell of petroleum refineries on the winter air, the same streets and apartment complexes and school buildings that had existed on December 8, 2025, before everything changed. The 87th Street apartments were still there. The memorial at the complex entrance, candles, flowers, stuffed animals, a small pair of children's shoes, was still there. Life in the Permian Basin, which had survived oil booms and oil busts and every kind of human tragedy that accumulates over generations in a place, continued. But the community had been altered. Changed in the specific way that communities are changed by a crime that reaches into the most protected space, a family's home, and takes the people who should have been safest there. The eldest daughter, the 15-year-old girl who had survived December 9th and who would carry its weight for every year that followed, was not named in this story. She was not named because she deserved the protection that anonymity affords, and because her story, whatever it became, was hers to tell or not tell on her own terms and in her own time. What could be said about her future was this: she had survived something that would have broken most people entirely. She had been present for testimony about the deaths of her mother, her little sister, and her little brother. She had watched a court decide what to do with the boy who had done it. She would now have to decide, over the remaining years of her life, what to do with herself. The Odessa triple homicide left behind the questions that every case of juvenile violence leaves behind, unresolved and urgent. How does a 15-year-old obtain a legally purchased handgun? Who bears responsibility for the availability of weapons to young people with documented emotional instability and a history of violent ideation? What mechanisms, in schools, in mental health systems, in community support structures, could have identified this boy as dangerous before December 9th? Chief Gerke had confirmed one prior police contact. Were there warning signs in his school records, his interpersonal behavior, his social media presence, that had been visible but had not been assembled into a coherent picture of risk? These questions do not excuse the crime. They demand answers nonetheless. The case entered the broader national conversation about juvenile justice and firearms access almost immediately after the arrest. Odessa, Texas had experienced mass violence before. The 2019 Odessa Midland mass shooting was part of the community's traumatic memory. The Rodriguez case was not a mass shooting in the public space sense, but it was a targeted, premeditated multiple homicide by a minor who had obtained a firearm. The policy questions it raised, about red flag laws, about safe storage requirements, about the threshold for certifying juveniles to adult court, were not questions unique to West Texas. They were questions being asked in every state, in every community that had watched a young person walk into a space of safety and end lives that deserved to continue. He would grow up inside a correctional institution. He would receive a GED, perhaps additional education, the programming that Texas's correctional system provides to lifers. He would age. He would, in all probability, spend decades filing legal challenges, appeals, post-conviction motions, the machinery of a system that never fully closes the door on review. Some of those challenges might succeed in modifying the procedural record. None of them could modify the record of December 9, 2025. None of them could bring back a 9-year-old boy, a 13-year-old girl, or the mother who had been raising them in a North Odessa apartment. The justice he received was the justice the evidence demanded. His life, going forward, would be the long, unmarked sentence of time in a place where futures do not accumulate. He had walked into those apartments with a gun in his hand and the belief, implicit, catastrophic, adolescent in the worst sense of that word, that his pain was worth more than 3 other human lives. The judge who sentenced him had looked at everything: the evidence, the victim impact, the mitigation arguments, the developmental science, the 9-year-old's autopsy report. And the judge had decided, with the authority that the law had placed in that courtroom, that some acts, regardless of the age of the person who commits them, require a permanent answer. The boy who had planned a murder, changed the plan when it felt risky, and executed 3 people in their home had believed he was acting from a position of power. He left the courtroom in handcuffs, with the rest of his life mapped out inside walls he would never leave. That is the specific, unadorned shape of justice in this case. Jessica Rodriguez's daughter survived. She was the only one who did. And in that survival, painful, grief-saturated, permanently altered, there is, if one looks carefully enough, the shape of everything her mother had built for her. The resilience, the community, the instinct to ask for help, the ability to keep standing even when standing feels impossible. The candles at the 87th Street apartments burned for weeks. The community of Odessa carried its grief forward, as communities always do. And somewhere in the Texas correctional system, a young man who had believed for approximately 40 minutes that he could run away from what he had done, began to understand that running was over. The gavel had fallen. The smirk had disappeared. Justice, cold and final, had found its way. If you believe accountability matters, for children and for adults, make sure others see this story. Share it. Discuss it. And ask the question that cases like this demand: what could we have done sooner?